morning, dear Director Trautmann, dear Mr. Fuchs, dear colleagues, dear EGC and MEPs, dear participants. I really kindly welcome you all to this meeting, and I'm particularly thankful to Director Trautmann that she accepted our invitation and agreed to not only answer our questions, but also to discuss with us, as she is the acting director on the DG Southern Neighborhood, and so an expert we need in this really important discussion. We decided to schedule this particular meeting for several reasons. First, and that I think it's quite logic, the topic of anti-Semitism in textbooks is of particular interest and concern to the working group against anti-Semitism and the Jewish communities. We deeply believe in the European values and therefore the Jewish life to belong in the middle of our European societies. We are happy about the changes we could make in the last year, like, for example, the Council's declaration on anti-Semitism as a cross-cutting issue in December 2020, and the new Commission strategy against anti-Semitism we discussed only last month as WGAS with the Vice President and Commissioner Skinas. The more it hurts us to read about the content of textbooks that only exist thanks to an educational infrastructure that the European Union, together with other donors, enables the Palestinian Authority to have. Reading about negative attributions in relation to the Jewish people, depicting Jews as dangerous, demonizing them, perpetuating anti-Jewish prejudices and hatred is just upsetting. But reading about school books, and there I speak also as a mother, for a 10-year-old kid, glorifying terrorist Dalal al-Mughrabi, presenting cold-blooded violence against civilians, including a lot of children, as resistance, leaves speechless. Portraying Israeli soldiers as child murderers is contributing to reinforce a conflict and mutual hatred that lasted for too long. I hope you can understand that this is traumatizing for some members of the Jewish communities and also produces a huge frustration concerning the lack of progress of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not only about textbooks. It is about hatred and stereotypes and pure fear of the other that is via anti-Semitic stereotypes passed on from generation to generation, manifesting and reinforcing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more and more, so that a peaceful solution, we all wish that this peaceful solution of the conflict gets more out of sight than ever before. Related to this frustration, it's a second reason why we scheduled this meeting, to restore trust in the goodwill of the European Commission to finally tackle the issue. We all know that the topic of anti-Semitic textbooks on Palestinian territory is smoldering for years. High Representative Mogherini initiative for requesting a report on Palestinian school books in 2019 could have been a turning point. But before the study implemented by the renowned German Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research could maybe become a turning point in the future policy for the European neighborhood south, an allegedly leaked immediate report produced confusion and mistrust first. An investigation of a journalist of the German newspaper Tagesspiegel insinuated the wrong books had been evaluated, implying apparent anti-Semitism had been intentionally overlooked and covered up by the Georg Eckert Institute. Several articles in big news outlets like Bild and Welt followed, also suspecting the European Commission to hold back the report's final publication and citing representatives of the German Foreign Federal Office and the Federal Ministry for Development, arguing for an immediate publication of the report. This coverage damaged a lot the image of the neutral European Commission, being only the contracting party, and raised a lot of questions, especially after the report was always set to be published soon and then delayed again. I personally tried with my team very early to approach the Georg Eckert Institute to comment on the accusations made, but received a reply from the European Commission instead that told me, amongst others, that they would not comment on the report until it has been finished, and that they are only contracting party. Only step by step in a tough process my office and Lega's could gather information and got in contact with Commission finally, when the report was published in June this year. Unfortunately, the report, as we know, the report's findings confirmed the upsetting expectation of malicious incitement and severe anti-Semitism. To summarize these findings again, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Dr. Eckhard Fuchs, Director, and Professor Dr. Reem Spielhaus, Head of Department, Knowledge and Transition from the Georg Eckert Institute, who will shortly introduce the main findings of the report so that we can discuss them in all transparency. Findings that brought also back the question of if supporting the educational infrastructure of the PA with European taxpayers' money is a misuse, as long as there is anti-Semitism and incitement in these textbooks. Our colleague and board member, Frederick Ries, tabled an amendment in the Budget Committee to approach this facet of the problem. The amendment aims to establish a reserve fund within the European Union money sent to help UNRWA. If accepted, it would free 3% of the funds until the textbook used by UNRWA are reformed. Such and similar ideas and related questions will surely be still very often be discussed in the Budget and Con Committee, where we just had a huge hearing to the same topic last week. But today, and I want really emphasize this, but today I am now coming to the third reason why we scheduled this meeting, because the Budget and Con meeting already happened on the financial question. I hope in this hearing we can focus on the future and envisage a rather constructive approach based on the findings of the study. So this is also the reason I'm really happy, Director Trautmann, that you are here. I hope you can tell us later how the Commission sees the findings of the study. Did they come uninspected, and what do you do with them now? So what are the consequences? How can they be a turning point in our policy? What impact do they have for your projects in the Palestinian territories? I hope our discussion can be a kickoff for a constructive dialogue for the next steps and maybe for an agreement between various stakeholders, similar to an educational compact on peace and mutual understanding. This is why I'm also delighted to welcome Mr. Steven Stegers, Executive Director for the European Association of History Educators, short Euroclio. I have heard already very interesting things about your experience. You worked on history educational projects in the Western Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the European Union and the Middle East, and you have been an expert for the Council of Europe and many other organizations. Today, you will share with us how educators from the network of Euroclio are facing the challenge of teaching history in divided societies. I hope together we can find ways of putting an end to harmful educational concepts and towards educational curricula free from prejudice, hatred, and incitement, so that there is mutual respect, understanding, and tolerance. Now I pass the floor to my colleague David Lega, who is also a board member from the Working Group Against Anti-Semitism. He will share with us the thoughts and his perspective on the topic in this introductory remarks. Dear David, please, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And I would like to start by joining you in welcoming all our panelists, all our experts, and naturally also Henrike Trautmann to this meeting. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here with us. And thank you all who's listening to joining in this very, very important discussion. Because the discussion that will take place today is one of great importance. It is about our core values as Europeans and how we apply those values in our work. We have to ensure that every decision made by the European Union is made in coherence with our values. And thus it is in our common interest to evaluate Palestinian textbooks and their alignment with our values. So the purpose of today's meeting is to discuss a way forward in combating anti-Semitism after the revelation of anti-Semitic material being used in the education of Palestinian children. And to find a path forward, we need to evaluate what has gone wrong in the process. Helping Palestinians reach their potential through education must never excuse anti-Semitism, incitement to violence, or hatred. Because in Europe, we are all too familiar with where this kind of propaganda can lead to, especially when children are exposed to it. Europe's history is stained with bigotry, paving the way to genocide and leading to the Holocaust, the ultimate manifestation of anti-Semitism. So the end goal of the work in Palestine should be peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians, a two-state solution where both countries respect each other's borders and also their security. With this in mind, we must ask ourselves if Palestinian schools are really being used to build peace and to scrutinize the wider effects. The report by the Georg Eckert Institute showed us that teachers are still using textbooks promoting anti-Semitism, violence, and hatred. I have just a couple of examples from different subjects in school. In grammar, I mean, it's hard to believe, but Palestinian children are still being taught grammar with sentences like, "We will defend the motherland with blood," and the Palestinian died as a martyr to defend the motherland. In math, math is taught using calculations of convicted terrorists and martyrs, including suicide bombers. In religion, I mean, we have textbooks in religious studies. Discussion topics include attempts by Jews to kill the Prophet Muhammad, while some textbooks depict Jews as treacherous and deceiving. And as you also mentioned, Nicola, the terrorist and murderer Dalal al-Mughrabi is portrayed as a champion for women, even though she was part of the killing of 38 people, including 13 children. It is clear to anyone who has read the Eckert Institute report that the textbooks, despite having removed some of the most extreme content, are still teaching children anti-Semitism and hatred in Palestine. And so I, like many others, fail to understand how the textbooks can largely adhere to UNESCO standards of peace, tolerance, and nonviolence, and at the same time promote the most abhorrent anti-Semitism. As a member of the European Parliament, I have an obligation to my constituents to ensure that their taxpayers' money goes to just causes representing our values. So for this, we also need to examine UNRWA's role as primary refugee organization handling Palestinian refugees. The European Union is the second biggest contributor to UNRWA's work. My own country, Sweden, is the fourth largest contributor to UNRWA. European member states rank at the top on UNRWA's contribution donor list. As with any organization receiving taxpayer money from the EU or member states, we expect it to respect some fundamental principles. First, a high degree of transparency, and second, the organization must align with the core values of the European Union. UNRWA's rigorous systems have not been enough to stop these textbooks being used by their own teachers funded by us. The damage is already done, and we need to hold those responsible accountable. Not only do we need Europeans to carefully examine where our aid ends up, but we also need to hold UNRWA accountable for this fiasco. In June, Commissioner Vaheli tweeted that conditionality of financial assistance in UNRWA's educational sector to be duly considered, and I hope that this view enjoys wide support in DG NEAR. Because as you might be aware, I recently proposed an amendment together with my colleagues, MEP Mandel and MEP Flexman, to next year's budget that would halt financial aid to the UNRWA's educational sector until the organization meet the conditions that are aligned with the European core values. Therefore, aid to UNRWA must be made reliant on the organization meeting criteria of transparency and combating anti-Semitism in Palestinian classrooms. Implementing these changes in the EU's approach will ensure that the aid being sent to Palestine is effectively used for the purpose of building peace, acceptance, and tolerance. So with this in mind, I would like to pass the floor to Director Trautmann, who will hold a few introductory remarks. She will then introduce us to our guests from the Georg Eckert Institute, and then Ms. Trautmann will summarize the findings before we go into our first round of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, MEP Lega. Thank you very much, MEP Beer, honorable members. Thanks a lot for organizing this indeed very important event, and thanks a lot for organizing it with the European Commission as an invitee. Very, very happy to be here today and to actually tackle this enormously important topic, which has been indeed, as you said, going on for a long time, and I think it's time to really now look a little bit into details and discuss how we go forward. And indeed, the title of the event, How to Bring About Change, is really what the European Commission is looking at. So it's more of a forward-looking approach of what do we have now as a baseline and where do we go from here. So let me very briefly explain the reasons why the EU decided to fund the study and what our intended follow-up will be. As you know, and it was already mentioned, the EU does not directly fund the Palestinian textbooks, but the EU and other European donors collectively support the Palestinian education sector and the provision of quality service in a wide range of ways, including, in the case of the EU, the payment of teacher salaries. Therefore, the decision to fund an independent study of Palestinian textbooks against defined international benchmarks, particularly based on UNESCO standards in education, reflected our interest in finally receiving a critical, comprehensive and objective basis for a policy dialogue with the Palestinian Authority in the education sector and to promote quality education services, including by addressing allegations of incitement. We think that we now have this baseline to work on, and indeed now the question will be, where do we go from here? I would briefly just come back to the question of the delays invoked by MEP Beer and the question why it has taken so long. The main reason for that is indeed that as this is such a sensitive and important subject, it is a study which really needed the time and also needed the time for a due diligence check before being finalized. You know, it's not a topic, as you all know very well, you can just come out with intermediate ideas and pre-versions. The European Commission was always determined to wait till it's completely finalized, and we have done all the checks, and the Georg Eckert Institute is equally happy with the outcome, and we're ready to publish. It has taken longer than we would have wished. The coronavirus pandemic hasn't particularly helped on some of these issues either, but it has taken the time it has, but now here we are. And as I said, again, very, very happy to be here today to discuss the outcomes, but also to discuss where we go from here. With your permission, I would now ask Professors Eckhard Fuchs and Riem Spielhaus from the Georg Eckert Institute to actually introduce briefly the outcomes, and then I will take the floor back. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much again for the invitation to this, from our point of view, also very important meeting, which gives us the chance, although very briefly, to give us the chance to present some of our main findings. Right now I'm trying to download our first, or to upload our presentation. Let me just try if that works. Which one is it? This one, yeah. Right. Let's see. Is that the right report? Can you all see that? That would be my question.
Great.
Can you see the presentation? Okay.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. We'll try to be very short, and Riem Spielhaus will give it a short summary about the main findings of our study.
So first, the focus of the report is, and also the background of the report is that the Palestinian Authority initiated a curriculum reform in the year 2016 and 17. The Georg Eckert Institute was asked to analyze a sample of around 156 textbooks and 16 teacher guides published between 2017 and 2019 by the Palestinian Ministry of Education, considering all school years and subjects for use in general education schools regarding how they address central issues of citizenship education, whether and how peace and tolerance are incorporated in them, to what extent they contain incitement of violence and hatred, and if so, in what ways. The analysis revealed a complex picture, and all these 3 points are valid parallel, as we found in our analysis. And this is the textbook largely adhere to UNESCO standards and adopt criteria that are prominent in international education discourse, including a strong focus on human rights. But parallel to this, they express a narrative of resistance within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they also display an antagonism towards Israel. So I very quickly will go through some of the findings. The textbooks extensively address central issues of global citizenship education. In numerous instances, the textbooks call for tolerance, mercy, forgiveness, and justice. And they do convey the concept of civil rights and in relationship between the citizens and the state. And they also call for tolerance in the context of religious diversity and ethnic diversity within the global context. They also promote political participation in the context of citizenship education. However, they also address awareness of human rights, also concerning inalienability of human rights. They address specific group rights, including rights of women, rights of disabled people, and many other contexts. They do address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the context of human rights discourse. And here they quote in numerous cases international court documents, for instance, UNESCO documents from the discourse of human rights. These 3 aspects have been increasing between the years 2017, when the first versions of textbooks of the new generation of textbooks were published, and 2019, and they again increased in the last 2020-21 textbook versions. And especially in the context of human rights discourse, we see that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is addressed in a way that allows students to be introduced in a language of international law and of human rights, a discourse that allow to address problems and challenges to their human rights without any incitement, and position themselves in the global discourse. However, and this is where we are, and we found numerous instances for this conclusion. However, we also found, and this is what we looked at very intensively in the report, and we'll probably discuss it today, rightly so, in large. We also found antagonistic narratives and one-sided representations of the Israeli others, and we looked very deeply into this issue. While the analysis identifies an increased focus on global citizenship education, it also finds these antagonistic narratives. This primarily applies to the terminology used throughout the textbooks in portrayals of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts when referring to the adversary. The term Israel occurs relatively seldom, while the term Zionist occupation or occupation dominates the books. The cartographic representations of all Palestine as a political entity, a geographical region, or an imagined homeland generally do not include the state of Israel or cities founded by Jewish immigrants. A few maps show the borders of the West Bank and the settlements within it, thus visualizing the disconnected territorial space administered by the Palestinian Authority. However, in one instance, a source documents the recognition of Israel's right to exist in peace, security, and security documented in the letters by Yasser Arafat to Yitzhak Rabin, and that stands, however, in the contrast to the questioning of legitimacy of the state of Israel expressed in other passages and textbooks, as we found. While 2 Islamic education textbooks deal ambivalently with the motives of loyalty and treason in reference to some Jewish tribes in the context of early Islam, one textbook provides a learning context that displays clearly anti-Semitic motives and narratives, and links characteristics and actions attributed to Jews at the dawn of Islam to the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, we found that representations of violence differ according to subjects. And here, the textbooks for Arabic language contain very emotionally laden depictions of Israeli violence that tend to dehumanize the Israeli adversary, occasionally accusing the latter of malice and deceitful behavior. They depict past acts of violence committed by Palestinian Jewish paramilitary groups during the British Mandate and subsequently against Israel as part of a heroic struggle against a colonizing oppressor. And thus, and here, that is something that has been referred to now. They also present past aggressiveness as legitimate. Textbooks for history, geography, and social studies take a more conceptual approach, consistently placing the facts within the narrative of national resistance. The Israeli opponent is portrayed as aggressive and hostile. In many of these textbooks passages, the language is, however, for the most part, objective in tone and avoids inflammatory expressions. Violence perpetrated by Palestinians, including violence against civilians, is presented as a legitimate means of resistance in certain periods of Palestinian history, contrasted with peaceful and diplomatic ways of confronting Israel. Especially in higher school years, students are asked to reflect on the use of different means of resistance and to evaluate them. I will quickly say something about the changes and that and coming to an end with looking at possible changes in the future. An overview conducted after the initial completion of this report compared 18 textbooks released online in 2020 by the Palestinian Ministry with earlier versions and found some significant differences. In addition to the increased representation of female and Christian positions, there is a reduction in texts and images that have escalatory potential, including the alteration of a specific teaching unit that included anti-Semitic content by several significant changes of the narrative. Some references to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in mathematics and natural science textbooks have been erased completely. References to protagonists of armed Palestinian resistance have in some places been altered or removed. And this is where I finish, and I'm open for discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, both to Professor Fuchs and Professor Spielhaus for this presentation. So let me maybe briefly set it a little bit into context now as far as the follow-up goes, but maybe just to start, I mean, it's clear that the study reveals that the analyzed textbooks, and again, we haven't analyzed, well, the colleagues from GI haven't analyzed all the textbooks, they've analyzed about 55%. They do adhere to, according to their analysis, to the UNESCO guidelines on human rights education, and that they generally promote political pluralism and stress cultural, social, and religious values that support coexistence. On the other hand, it is very clear that the study does reveal the existence of a very deeply problematic content that remains of serious concern, and therefore we can't leave it as that. There is a need to work further. We do see a trend in the recent new school books issued, but obviously this will have to continue, and this is where there is a role for the EU to continue pushing this process. Just to repeat that the EU has no tolerance for incitement to hatred, violence as a means to achieve political goals, and anti-Semitism in all its forms. These principles are non-negotiable for this Commission. Any material that goes against them risks undermining peace and coexistence and has no place in textbooks or classrooms. As MEP Beer said rightly at the beginning, this is not the way to get to a peaceful coexistence in the Middle East, and that can't be repeated enough. So our aim when deciding to fund the study was indeed to provide ourselves with a baseline for the EU's engagement with the Palestinian Authority on educational reform, and the changes to the curriculum are essential, with a view to bring about full adherence to UNESCO standards of peace, tolerance, coexistence, and non-violence in all Palestinian education materials. We believe that, however complicated the conflict is, the Palestinian Authority must ensure the highest standards in fostering a culture of peace and coexistence, paving the way for a future where the conflict can be solved through negotiations leading to a two-state solution. So what's next? The EU is planning to step up its engagement with the Palestinian Authority on the basis of this study, with the aim to ensure that further curriculum reform, because this is an ongoing process, addresses the highly problematic issues identified in the shortest possible time frame, and that the Palestinian Authority takes responsibility to screen textbooks not analyzed in the study so far. Full compliance of all educational material with UNESCO standards of peace, tolerance, coexistence, and non-violence must be ensured, as must any reference of anti-Semitic nature to be addressed and taken out. So we will agree concretely with the EPA a specific roadmap with clear benchmarks for this work, which must include a comprehensive system of policy dialogue, continuous engagement, and incentives with the express purpose of promoting and facilitating change, accompanied by a rigorous system of monitoring of progress. The roadmap must also establish an objective and credible process of screening and monitoring of educational material, of which the PA will be responsible, and that will again ensure coherence with UNESCO standards. So in order to kick off this process, outreach to the Palestinian Authority is ongoing. The issue has been discussed twice with His Excellency the Prime Minister Shtayyeh. My Director General Maciej Popowski, who was presenting the study the other day in the CONT committee, met the PM in July, and further exchanges have taken place both in Ramallah and at different levels from headquarters. The Commission takes this study extremely seriously and will act on its finding as appropriate, with a view to bring about the full adherence to the UNESCO standards in all Palestinian education materials. We are very confident that the PA understands the importance of this issue and the need to proceed rapidly. Maybe one additional remark regarding the role of UNRWA, since this was brought up already in the introductory remarks. So as you know, UNRWA is using the material of the host country everywhere. So they don't have their own textbooks, they are using the Palestinian PA Authority textbooks. We are also in very close contact with UNRWA. We met Director General Lazzarini last week regarding the study and regarding the follow-up. So they are constantly looking at the material. They're constantly reviewing the material, and they have indeed identified the same very problematic issues and content that the GEI study hasn't identified. So this is being addressed from both sides, if you want. They have also, as you might know, set up a new digital learning platform, which is accessible via the internet, one of the results of the pandemic, which will also allow a better scrutiny of the kind of materials that are being used in classrooms. So this is a little bit the roadmap we are looking at. Timings is being discussed. We're having outreach also to the Ministry of Education, of course, of the Palestinian Authority, but it is clear that this is the starting point of a conversation and not the end of a conversation. We do believe, though, that we will have to continue to have that conversation in order to be able to be an agent of change in this context in the Middle East. Just to come back to an overall background, I mean, the position of the EU is very clear. Anti-Semitism has no place in any context anywhere in the world, and we have to combat it actively. This applies in our relation with the Palestinian authorities, and it also applies inside the EU. As you already mentioned, to boost this action, this year the European Commission will present a comprehensive EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. And the strategy will support and complement EU member states' efforts in their national actions plans to combat anti-Semitism. The strategy will also seek to place the EU firmly in the lead of the global fight against anti-Semitism, because it does need a holistic response where the European, national and international levels work hand in hand, and where the fight against anti-Semitism is mainstreamed across all relevant policy areas. And obviously the area we're discussing today is a very relevant area. So I would suggest I stop here. Looking forward to exchanges and thank you for your attention so far.
Thank you very much for these insights of the topic. I think first steps taken, we have to go further, but before I open the discussion round, I just want to read out a statement by our dear colleague Dietmar Köster, who cannot be with us. Dear Ms. Trautmann, dear fellow colleagues, unfortunately, I cannot participate in this very important meeting, but MEP Bear has kindly agreed to read a statement of mine, as this subject is very important to me. I have serious concerns about the anti-Semitic content in Palestinian textbooks, in which children are being taught that to hate Jews and reinforce enemy images, and because the EU directly pays the salaries of the Palestinian teachers using this hateful material in their classrooms. We must withhold at least some funding to the PA until it finally replaces these unacceptable textbooks. We discussed this issue on many occasions already, lastly in the Foreign Affairs Committee last week with Philip Lazzarini, the UNRWA Commissioner General. I believe it's finally time to take action now. I hope that this meeting will be a fruitful one, and please once again accept my apologies for not being able to attend to today, and many thanks. After having heard this statement, let me first pass the floor to Ilana Sikurel, our colleague from the Working Group Board, for her question. Ilana, yes. The floor is yours.
Yes, hello, Nicola. Thank you for your involvement in this important subject. And thank you for all the panelists for being with us this morning. I have to say that I have been very astonished, not to say shocked, by something that is a kind of contradiction in this report, a contradiction between what unacceptable contents, and thank you to my colleague David Lega to have reminded these exercises in grammar, mathematics, this Shahada portrayed as a hero. So this is, even more dangerous when you find this type of anti-Semitic content in a grammar or exercise, because it means that it is really deeply integrated in the culture. So this is and so for me the contradiction is what you are revealing and the fact that you can write a sentence like it largely fits with criteria of coexistence, promotion of peace and respect that are developed by UNESCO. It is, for me, there is a big contradiction. So it's not, okay, you are pointing out a kind of trend. Okay, there is less anti-Semitism, so it's okay. So thank you to it has just been said that anti-Semitism is not acceptable, and it's not a little bit of anti-Semitism, a bit more. I mean, we have to send a strong message now. So my question is, and thank you for this meeting, but what are the concrete measures that the Commission will take to send a strong message that we are not going to accept this anti-Semitic content, and we are not going to banalize them, and to accept the type of content that you are revealing in this report has to lead us to concrete measures. I mean, this question is not new, and I think that there is also a very, very dangerous message that we would send if we are not doing something very, very powerful. And we know that education and lead to acts, and so we have to stop this culture of hatred. And so for me, it is, I am a bit this report is at the same time interesting because it reveals interesting things, but I cannot understand your conclusion. And I would like the Commission to say what are the concrete measures that are going to be taken, because it's I think that anti-Semitism is a very, very serious question, and what is going on in Palestine has effects also in Europe, and we have now to show that we are not going to accept this anymore, and I would like to know how the Commission and what will be undertaken to reach these results. Thank you.
Maybe I can take it together with the question of Dragos Tugarache. Dragos, you're there. Do you want to have a question for the Commission, and then Mrs. Trautmann can answer both questions in common?
Yes, thank you very much, Nicola, and good morning to everyone. I don't know how to put it differently than my colleague has just did, because I am also very puzzled of how the two assumptions or the two conclusions or the two facts, the two realities can coexist. I think in any of our societies or democratic systems, a single sentence like that in a manual in school would bring down a government. It's as simple as that. And the fact that, and as my colleague was saying, this is not contradictions or statements that you find in a history book. I'm not saying that there it would be understandable or forgivable, but you could say, well, it's a history book. Histories can be written or read in different ways, and you can then pinpoint your action. The fact that you have these systematically in disciplines that are not about history are simply putting the mental hooks in there that are just impossible to replace, particularly if you start at very young ages. So again, I also want to ask the Commission what actually, now that we know this, now the report says this, so number one, how are we reconciling those conclusions and living with those conclusions, and then two, what will we do about it? And I want to also enlarge, if possible, a bit the question on the conversation, because for me, the key thing is textbooks in today's digital age, and here I put my hat as an artificial intelligence focused MEP, and we discuss a lot about the role of education and how education and digital transformation these days play together. And for me, a textbook is in fact, in this day and age, and for today's digital minds and kids, this is only a fraction of what their education and formation actually is. Because in fact, they are bombarded with information from the digital online world, not to mention what they get from their family. And if we put this in the Palestinian context, and we can imagine the kind of information that those children have already from their online digital lives, and also what they get from their community and families. And then if on top of that we add what they get in their textbooks, then from my point of view, then the cocktail is perfect. And to imagine that we somehow can build a barrier from the generation to generation pass on of bias and hatred is just simply an impossible task. So I think that beyond the issue of textbooks, we also have to discuss about how do we instill critical thinking in the way we educate Palestinian minds, and how do we make sure that, again, beyond textbooks, the other environment around them can be changed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dragos. So we have a perfect mixture today on the panel, because I now give the floor shortly for Ms. Trautmann on the political consequences. And then we have Stephen Stegers with us, because he is an expert in those educational questions. He already had projects in those difficult situations just to stop this and to have this wall and not to transmit from generation to generation. And I suppose he is also firm in the digital world and not only in textbooks. So please, Mrs. Trautmann, because we're running a little bit out of time, but I think it's really important to hear Mr. Stegers with his best practice example. So Mrs. Trautmann, please.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, first of all, on the first question of Ilana Cruel, I mean, it's totally clear that a little bit of anti-Semitism is not okay. We can't say because it's less before, now it's fine. I mean, this is why the Commission is determined to instill a process here with concrete progress, and we will consider appropriate measures as necessary in this regard. If the progress is not seen in the roadmap we're setting up, then we will have to monitor, and we will have to consider what can be done. So this is, as I said, the beginning of a conversation and not the end. On the question how the UNESCO standards and anti-Semitism and some of these contents in the textbooks actually go together, I would, but maybe we can do that towards the end, like to pass the floor back to the two experts, because I'm not an education expert. I'm sure there's some explanation on that, but it is clear now, whatever that part says, for us, it's clear, even if the trend was different, there's a reason to act, and this is what we're planning to do. Very briefly on the question of MEP Tudorache, I think this is actually an extremely important point, and it's also revealed inside the study that, of course, textbooks, particularly written textbooks, are only part of the equation, and we will have to look generally at the context in the West Bank and Gaza, to be able to see what people are influenced in, and particularly young people. And there an ongoing dialogue with the Palestinian Authority, but also a monitoring of what is out in the public space is an extremely important thing. And as you said, there is discussions ongoing on artificial intelligence and content on internet platforms, which the Commission is taking extremely seriously. That's why I mentioned also the digital platform UNRWA has been setting up. This is a way to monitor also more proactively what is actually out there, because the textbooks, obviously, they are not being okayed by the European Commission on the ground. This is something where we have the dialogue with the Palestinian Authority. So these days, internet definitely is more important than what is on paper. I will maybe stop here, and then happy to come back to some of these elements later. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Professor Fuchs, you can give a short answer on that, on if maybe this is the most important, if the UNESCO is working on this contradiction, because I think it's not acceptable and shows in contrary that if you are teaching human rights for yourself, but not accepting that the other has also human rights, then the sentence that it is concrete with the standards of UNESCO is not worse. The paper is written on it. So maybe you have a short answer on that, because I really want to go then further to Mr. Stegers, and I know that the EGC and so on has also questions, but I think it fits to the best practice examples we can hear about. So, Professor Fuchs, or do you?
Thank you very much. It's of course very difficult to answer in a very short time to very complex questions. But what I can say is, on our conclusion itself is not contradicting. It just basically mirrors the complexity of the textbooks and the content in the textbooks itself. And what we see in the textbooks is both sides. And of course, we cannot wage them against each other. We cannot say, as Ms. Trautmann just said, you know, we are happy if there's less anti-Semitism and the textbooks are fine. That's not how it works. But what we really could find that we find in many cases images, phrases, textbooks that follow some UNESCO standards, but others don't, and that we have to show, and we showed it, and that's why the contradiction is that it is. The textbooks do the one thing and the other as well. What follows out of that observation and the conclusion is another step, and that's of course what we're going to discuss and what's going to be in the future. Of course, I can only confirm that any kind of anti-Semitism and any kind of call for violence or promotion of hate has to be removed from any textbook in the world, not even in a Palestinian textbook. That's very clear. But again, the conclusion itself we draw is not contradictory. It just mirrors what we found in the textbooks.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Stegers, we really looking forward to you, because you can have maybe for us a path in the future, as you have experience in that difficult and complex field. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope I can, it's a challenging task to now share all the experiences, because also there is limited time. And of course, we've worked in several countries. So I prepared a presentation for this to also make it a bit more lively. I just wanted to check if you now can see the full screen. Okay. So I will focus on the experiences from Euroclio, the European Association of History Educators, and our member association, specifically on teaching history in divided societies, but also conflict and post-conflict situations, but also draw on some research and resources that were made by people and organizations we work with. And in the report on Palestinian textbooks, like the authors, they are singling out history education as having an enormous capacity to exacerbate or reconcile conflicts. And I think this is definitely true. That's also something that we recognize. Even this week, we had like an attack on our Serbian History Teachers Association because of the work that they are doing with the UN. There's also been today in the news that, for example, in Cyprus, textbooks are again criticized. It's very political, but it's not new. So, for example, there has been, and a lot of thinking already went into how to deal with this complexity. So, for example, the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly also recognized this already in 2009. So one of the recommendations that I would definitely have is to also make use of all this literature, all this recommendation, all this research. And I want to start with the positive, because if you say, okay, well, it can either aid to more conflict or help to sort of de-escalate and lead to mutual understanding, I think there's a lot of potential for history education. So in the best case, students are challenged to ask critical questions, to do their own research, to also recognize when history is being misused or when they're being manipulated. And it can help with apathy, fake news, disinformation, stereotypes, discrimination. But it needs to be also delivered in a way that is, I think, is active and fun and inquiry-based, experiential, empowering. And for us, always the key is that students are taught not how to think and are not told what to think. So the methods are very important. And in this context, I also wanted to share one observation that I have on the whole debate. I also listened into the presentation last week with the Cont Committee. And I have the feeling that when you talk about anti-Semitism, that people are really talking about different things. So there were clear identification also in the study, like how anti-Semitism has been interpreted by the researchers. And of course, there are also other UNRWA, IRA, for example, they also have the definition and different researchers have the definition. So to move forward and to sort of see our textbooks anti-Semitic, you need to have a common understanding, because if you all have your own interpretations, I think you can be stuck. And that's also with good history education, you can help to deal with this ambiguity. And one research I would like to single out, because this is actually, it's funded actually by the European Union, and that's been published. And there were researchers who were specialists and experts on the study of post-conflict society. They looked at how history education can contribute to conflict transformation. It's an open access publication, so everybody can look at that. And they basically had one of their main conclusions was that they need, in order to move forward to really transform conflict, they need to have an epistemologically more advanced way of teaching history dealing with memory. In other words, students need to have a deeper understanding of how knowledge is created. So it's not just, okay, there is one truth and these are the experts and we believe that, but actually to see, okay, on the basis of what do you draw your conclusion to really interrogate. So they ask for, okay, a different, more critical type. Another resource, this was, I think, a very special one, because it was made by a group of Arab and European experts. They came to a similar conclusion. And they say, we need not only focus on historical knowledge, but also on the concepts and the processes that underpin the discipline of history. And without such a strong foundation, it's impossible to see how authors can write textbooks that encourage students to take a multi-perspective approach. So I really, and it was mentioned by previous speakers also, it's not just the textbooks. You really need to have a whole educational system where the curriculum is aligned and the teacher training is aligned. And you have educators who have like a good, deep understanding. So without them, you can't move forward. And for me, a key question is also like, how are the textbooks used? And because teachers, what are they doing with the textbooks? Are they questioning? And even if I always like this example of when you talk about media literacy, probably you need to include some examples of fake news to teach about it. So if there is, and I mean, I haven't been doing this study, but if you even are able to recognize anti-Semitism, I think it's also good to include some sources to understand the concept, the same with like Islamophobia or when it's about propaganda. And of course, there are some sources that are age appropriate and others that are not. And I'm sure that many of the examples, even if you combine it with the methodology, are problematic. But when you use things in a very critical way, I think there should also be space to look at that. So don't take it at face value and make sure that there are like critical uses of all the materials. And for this, you need, in the end, inspiring and competent history citizenship educators. That's, I think, the most important factor. Excellent teachers can do still a very good education, even if the teaching materials aren't great. The opposite, and that's also even if the textbooks are very good, there's no guarantee that you will get actually not an education that is not inciting to hatred. And I don't think there is any research on like how the textbooks are used in classroom situations. So there's a lack of research, there is a lack of knowledge. So of course the textbooks are the easiest to understand and research because they're there. But you need to see how it's being used. And I think there are a lot of educators, like from our network, but also locally, who can help. And now to some examples where we can also learn from. So this is the UN buffer zone. And there is one of our members is the Association for Historical Dialogue and Research. And they actually created like a neutral space to meet. They already worked together before the borders were open in Nicosia. And the UN buffer zone was the only place where you could have people from the north and the south of Cyprus meeting. So they always meet across the divide. And on the right bottom, you can see the people representing like the different communities who were really committed to a joint approach. And at the moment, they've published several publications, including on difficult topics such as missing persons, which affected both sides. And the building that you see has now been transformed to the House of Cooperation, which is actually not only a place for history educators to meet, but even politicians from both sides are actually coming there and working together. But it's very important that this is also neutral ground. They can meet on equal footing. We also have actually colleagues in the Arab-speaking world. I think that's also very important. These are the colleagues from the Lebanese Association for History. They also work together with like colleagues, for example, from Egypt and Jordan. And there, the very sensitive issue is like the Lebanese civil war. So you also have, even though it's national history, a lot of people with different perspectives. The curriculum hasn't been revised, so they have a lot of similar challenges. And they started, for example, to start a dialogue process with the historians to make sure that they can have up-to-date, reliable knowledge, but also started to collect source material. So if you perhaps cannot publish a new textbook, collecting sources is also like a very good way forward. And then in the Balkans, we've been working there since 2003 with colleagues from Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia. We started with the least sensitive topics in a way. First, the history of Yugoslavia, then slowly started to address more sensitive and controversial issues. And now we are actually working on the recent Balkan Wars, so which is the most sensitive. But this has been taking almost 2 decades. Just very briefly, in the case of Israel and Palestine, there have been similar attempts also. I think several of you will be familiar with this publication from learning each other's historical narratives. And one of the authors actually called it the most successful failure because it's been lauded internationally, but on the ground it was banned by both educational authorities. And I think here are also a lot of positive approaches. So that's perhaps also a word of caution to say, okay, if you are banning textbook and saying this is not allowed, of course, you don't want to have incitement to hate, you don't want to have incitement to violence, you don't want to provide anti-Semitism or Islamophobia for that matter, it's not acceptable. But you also have to balance that with the freedom of speech and the freedom of profession. Because if you talk about extracurricular activities, if you want to, for example, teach about current affairs, you do want as a teacher to choose the materials that are most suitable at the moment. So the main takeaways, I think it's important to broaden the scope. The textbooks are only one piece of the puzzle. There are the curricula, there are exams, teacher training, there's continued professional development. When you talk about trust building and a long-term solution, you need all parties, all groups, and really build trust. Don't start with the most sensitive issues first. And I think the experience with the book Learning Each Other's Narrative is also that you do need to also involve the government and civil society together. It takes time and also curious people, because if we have people in Israel and Palestine, but also in the Balkan context, a lot of the people who choose to cooperate are criticized by other members of their community. So you put them at risk. We even have people in Croatia who receive death threats because of the work that they're doing. So it's super sensitive, and we have to recognize that and also take responsibility. But you need to invest in people. You will only get quality textbook if you have quality authors. And there are a lot of history education professionals facing similar challenges in different contexts who can help. And there are a lot of resources, recommendations, research that can be used. So I leave it at that. I'm very happy to contribute or follow up in any way that is appropriate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stegers. I think this was a really, really helpful insight of your work. And I think we have really a lot of takeaways from that. Before coming to our end, because we already are running out of time, but I want also to give the EGC the possibility to comment, especially maybe on these takeoffs from the practical side to change an educational system, to try to install mutual respect and tolerance. So Johanna, maybe you want to introduce to come in for a short moment, and then we come to the final remarks of David Lega and myself. So Johanna, please.
Thank you, Ms. Beer. On behalf of the European Jewish Congress, I would like to express our thoughts and reservations at the findings of the report. Indeed, several instances of anti-Semitism, namely those related to classic, religiously motivated anti-Semitism, were correctly identified in the report. At the same time, other contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, which are no less harmful, in particular in the context of Jewish collective history and collective rights, were not identified as such. This raises the question, which linked to what Mr. Stegers mentioned, of which standard was relied on to assess anti-Semitism in the report. If one is unable to identify anti-Semitism, one cannot combat it. However, our biggest concern regarding the report is that there is a certain dissonance between these shocking examples of anti-Semitism, incitement and delegitimization, and the rather optimistic tone of the report, as Dr. Fuchs referred to. Yes, there has been arguably some progress. The removal of some of the most anti-Semitic passages can be regarded as reducing the escalatory potential, but we would advise against taking a relativistic or directional perspective to these findings. This would have the effect of minimizing the very real instances of anti-Semitism, which regrettably continue to appear in Palestinian textbooks. Finally, the report shows the importance of mainstreaming the fight against anti-Semitism in the EU's engagement in the region. And so, we're encouraged by Ms. Trautmann's remarks. Just to finalize, for European Jewish civil society, this is an issue of particular interest and consensus, and we look forward to achieving tangible progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, David, can I pass over to you, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Nicola. Thank you, Director Trautmann, all my colleagues at the Working Group Against Anti-Semitism, and also thank you to all our panelists for their valuable contributions. Investing in education is our best chance at breaking the circle of violence, which for over 70 years has hurt both Israelis and Palestinians. European engagement on this issue must be in the service of peace. We cannot afford to support another generation condemned to hatred and violence. Because hatred and prejudice are learned behaviors. No one is born an anti-Semite. And so it deeply saddens me to see Palestinian children still being exposed to alarming and harmful content in schools. And this is why the report by the Georg Eckert Institute was a unique opportunity. And on many instances, the report correctly identified the traditional anti-Semitism or conspiracy theories and its effects in escalating the conflict. And it also recognized the serious problems of incitement to violence and glorification of terrorism. But however, the report was also, unfortunately, in an important way, a missed opportunity because it failed to identify other contemporary forms of anti-Semitism that are just as poisonous as we have touched upon. So in order to combat anti-Semitism effectively, we need to rely on a comprehensive approach that includes all its manifestations. Denying the Jewish people its collective history and its right of self-determination and erasing its historical links to Jerusalem are also forms of anti-Semitism. As some of the speakers have pointed out, the study should have relied on the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism because the IRA definition is the international standard endorsed by the European Council, the European Parliament, and a majority of the member states. So by failing to be consequent on this issue, the report had the effect of at least relativizing, it's not justifying the very serious processes of radicalization that are happening on Palestinian schools. So in conclusion, it is an assault on European values, and as such, it needs to be considered consistently in all EU decisions and measures, and this very much includes our engagement with Palestine and our engagement with all relevant stakeholders, including UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority, but also Palestinian civil society. Promoting transparency and conditionality are essential tools, and from the European Parliament, we will continue promoting good practices. So I thank you, and with this, I would like to give the floor to Nicola Beer to deliver her closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, David, and thank to all the participants. I know this is very complex. This is also, in the most time, a very emotional topic, but I think we have to discuss on it because we have to make a stop on this generation by generation teaching of hatred and anti-Semitism. And so just because it's short in time, 2-3 thoughts on that, what we can take from this for the future to get in a better educational system without hatred. Because one is something is also clear, that only cutting funds for education might not be a solution, because the loss or lack of teachers due to the lack of funding would inevitably lead to more isolation of kids and maybe even more hatred. But what is also crystal clear for us, that we cannot accept that we are financing an educational system where the teachers we directly finance then has to use or are using anti-Semitic textbooks. Books. So for me, it's clear that we have to make sure that there are other materials. So we really have to care how to have other curricula, how to have other textbooks, how to have other teacher guides, and also education for teachers to give the start, to be the starting point for a change in these educational textbooks. So we have to work on that with EPA. We have to work on that with all the stakeholders in the educational system as organizations on the ground, the parents, the teachers organization, to change in that. And though I think maybe 2 steps could be taken. First is that when it's traveling is possible, and I hope it will be sooner, then that we have a mission to the Palestinian territories and to Israel, together with our both delegations. So to take the Israeli delegation and the Palestinian delegation in the EU Parliament on board, together with the working group against anti-Semitism, because I think if we cannot have a common approach on those specialized colleagues, then it will be difficult to have a common approach in Israel and Palestinian. But to go there and to try to see how we can help to come to an education for coexistence, for mutual respect and tolerance. We have to find new alliances in the civil societies and their actors, so to unite this civil society against anti-Semitism and hatred, and building bridges inside this society. My hopes are there on the new Israeli government, especially of the foreign minister Yair Lapid, who already gave some signals in that direction. And I hope that this can also give another reaction on the Palestinian side. So I hope we will strengthen with such a mission the ties to Europe again and help us to be a good broker, not only but also on the textbook case. And then second, I think maybe signing a sort of educational compact on peace and mutual understanding, similar to a referendum of understanding amongst the several stakeholders like local non-governmental organizations and the local authorities and the European institutions, bodies, to manifest our will to tackle the issue and turn words into action, could be a first step of internationalizing such an initiative and such a process to get to an education, and so far also to a young next generation without hate and anti-Semitism. And so I think at the end, but this is more for the Commission, Mrs. Trautmann, we have also to tackle with UNESCO, because this contradiction that it met the standards, teaching human rights, and it's not a problem for meeting the standards, when then in the same book, these human rights are not applicable to every human being in a society. This is not acceptable, and this will not help also the, I think, the standing of UNESCO in the world and in the civil society. So I think at the end we have also to work on that. But I am really pleading for some approach on the ground, a little bit like the project Mr. Steger has presented, and I think he will be a really important expert for us on that, so that the next report the Eckert Institute can make has really huge progress in the results on this educational system. Okay, thank you very much. This was only one of the first steps we have to take. It's a complex topic, but I'm really happy that we came so far to look more in the future and not in the reproaches. Both sides are always exchanging, and I hope we can really change with our possibilities and opportunities on this topic. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye.